This is the Music History In-Depth podcast for March 12th through the 18th. On this week's show, a country music group finds out the cost of free speech, a guitar legend leaves a band and starts a whole chain of events, the father of rock and roll passes away, and one of rap music's most important acts debuts. I've said before that this podcast is not about personal politics or racial matters, but that sometimes those things and music do mix, especially politics and music, so of course we have to talk about them. This story would be one of those times when politics and music definitely mixed. It is also an example of the fact that both conservatives and liberals love cancel culture, even as they rail against the other side's use of it. It's also an example of how sometimes free speech isn't actually free, and that rightly or wrongly, it will carry consequences that you may not anticipate. First, let's give the political backstory. In response to the attack on the United States on September 11, 2001, the United States, led by President George W. Bush, ex-governor of the state of Texas, invaded Afghanistan. The Texas part is important to the story, as you will see in a minute. Before 9/11, Bush had endured 8 months of, let's say, halfway decent poll numbers. Actually, they were kind of tanking. After a highly contested election in which he lost the popular vote to then Vice President Al Gore, but won the Electoral College. That discussion about Florida ballots hanging chads or whether Bush actually won Florida is for someone else's podcast, not mine. This one is all about how that affected music. Anyway, after the attacks on September 11th, patriotism was at an all-time high as people rallied around the president, making him extremely popular. In fact, at one time, I believe he had an 89% approval rating. In the first months after the invasion, there were signals put out in the press that other countries would soon feel the wrath of the United States. There was talk about how some countries had weapons of mass destruction, i.e. chemical and nuclear weapons, and the leaders of those countries needed to be taken out in what was then called regime change. Nice way of saying a coup is in essence. The main countries squarely in the United States crosshairs, Iraq. Iraq was led by dictator Saddam Hussein. Hussein was no angel by anybody's stretch of the imagination. He murdered his own people, and he had invaded Kuwait only a decade earlier, only to be beaten back by a coalition led by George W. Bush's father, then President George H.W. Bush. Because of that, Hussein also attempted to have George H.W. assassinated after H.W. left the presidency, only to have that plan discovered and foiled, but never forgotten or forgiven, especially by the son. During the next year, a case for an invasion of Iraq was built. The United States went to the United Nations to seek a resolution for invasion. The PR campaign was built upon how taking Iraq would be like Operation Desert Storm, which was the taking back of Kuwait in the early 1990s. And that one was over and done with within a few months. Quick in, quick out, done. In the beginning of the invasion, it certainly looked like that was the way this one was going to go. The United States quickly overwhelmed the Iraqi troops, and the war was, at that time, pretty popular with the American people. Now, remember that in order for you to understand music history, sometimes you have to understand the mindset of the times. That is why I gave you all that information. It's not so I could spout my opinion of the war, because at this point, my opinion really doesn't matter, nor do you need to know it. It is so that you know why what happened next actually happened. This is also where we get the musical connection from. There were some people, mainly outside the United States, who the war was very unpopular with, the people of Great Britain, for example. The Americans who spoke out against the war paid a heavy price. Think of this as the Israeli-Palestinian war of its time. If you took what was perceived as the wrong side, you paid a price. For instance, actresses Susan Sarandon and Janine Garofalo and actor Tim Robbins all suffered severe career backlash, as did this next group. The Dixie Chicks, now known as the Chicks, were a Texas band who were riding high in the early 2000s. They were one of the biggest country music artists of the era, with hits like Wide Open Spaces. They were doing a promotional tour in Great Britain in support of new music in 2003, when the war was about 2 weeks from beginning, as the first missiles and bombs actually started being dropped at 9:34 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on March 19th. During their concert at Shepherd's Bush Empire on March 10th, 2003 in London, England, singer Natalie Main said to the crowd, quote, "Just so you know, we're on the good side with y'all. We do not want this war, this violence, and we're ashamed the President of the United States is from Texas." End quote. Remember, the Chicks are also from Texas, hence the Texas connection. Natalie's bandmate, Emily Strayer, added, quote, "But you know we're behind the troops 100%. End quote. On March 12, 2003, reporter Betty Clark of the Guardian newspaper published a review of the concert. In the review, Clark mentioned what Natalie said, added that the crowd cheered, and then added, quote, "At a time when country stars are rushing to release pro-war anthems, this is practically punk rock." End quote. Once word got out stateside, reaction was swift and it was brutal. Some people thought that what Natalie said was traitorous. According to them, she should have been supporting President Bush. To say something negative, especially in England and not in America, was considered cowardly, at least in those people's eyes anyway. Country music fans called into radio stations demanding that they stop playing the Dixie Chicks songs, saying that the comments were disrespectful to the troops, even though they already said that they supported the troops, but whatever. Entire radio station networks banned stations from playing their music. 2 radio DJs, in fact, in Colorado were suspended for playing the Chicks' music. DJs called for not only boycotting their songs, but for people to not even buy their albums. There were album crushing parties where people brought Dixie Chicks CDs to be crushed by steamrollers. Other musicians joined in on the anti-Dixie Chicks bandwagon, the late Toby Keith, for instance. Even one of the group's own tour bus drivers quit in protest. Some musicians, though, like Bruce Springsteen and Merle Haggard, stood up and publicly supported them, although they didn't suffer any backlash for doing it. I mean, it's Springsteen. It's like going up against Taylor Swift or Dolly Parton these days. You are not going to win those battles, people. For the rest of the Dixie Chicks tour that year, a lot of their tour sponsors, like Lipton, backed out after getting backlash from people. Big radio stations blacklisted the Dixie Chicks for years. Their career sputtered to less than a crawl. It was stopped dead in its tracks. For his part, when asked about what the Dixie Chicks said, President Bush responded, quote, "The Dixie Chicks are free to speak their mind. They can say what they want to say. They shouldn't have their feelings hurt just because some people don't want to buy their records when they speak out. Freedom is a two-way street. I don't really care what the Dixie Chicks said. I want to do what I think is right for the American people, and if some singers or Hollywood stars feel like speaking out, that's fine. That's the great thing about America." End quote. For her part, Natalie apologized a few days after the backlash had started, saying that what she said was disrespectful. However, she took back the apology in 2006, saying that President Bush didn't deserve any respect. By that point, the public's approval of the invasion had soured, as American soldiers were still in the country and, most importantly, they were getting injured and killed. At the end of 2006, Saddam Hussein was killed by his own people after having been captured at the end of 2003. As far as President Bush went, he was reelected in 2004 due to the popularity of the war at the time mainly, but he ended his second term with some pretty horrific approval numbers. By the end of his second term, the lack of ending to the war, along with the housing bubble and financial meltdown in 2007 and 2008, had taken their toll on his presidency. In fact, as he left the inauguration on January 20th, 2009 of his successor, President Barack Obama, he was booed heavily by the crowd in the inauguration. So heavily that commentators had to remark about how rude and disrespectful the crowd was. And to be honest, they were. Considering the behavior of people on both sides of the aisle these days, though, including politicians, that era might now be considered the good old days of civility, sadly enough. Now, you would think that the story ends there and we would just move on to the next one. It does not. After enduring a few years of being blacklisted by corporate radio, yet another reason why corporate radio and media consolidation was a really bad idea, by the way. There's my political belief. And after it became rather apparent that the Iraq War was not exactly going according to script and was becoming increasingly unpopular, especially in America, the Dixie Chicks came storming back. In 2006, they put out an album called Taking the Long Way, which produced the autobiographical song I'm Not Ready to Make Nice. The song went on to win Song and Record of the Year at the following year's Grammy Awards, while the album won Album of the Year. They also put out a documentary called Shut Up and Sing, which chronicled the 3-year period from them singing the national anthem at the 2003 Super Bowl all the way through the commentary backlash. The film itself received some backlash of its own, as certain theaters refused to show it. The distributor of the movie said at the time, quote, "It's a sad commentary about the level of fear in our society that a movie about a group of courageous entertainers who were blacklisted for exercising their right of free speech is now itself being blacklisted by corporate America." End quote. That distributor was Harvey Weinstein, who ironically had been at the very same time using fear and intimidation to allegedly sexually harass and rape women for years until he himself was taken down, ironically, by a New Yorker magazine article in 2017, which helped to jumpstart the hashtag #MeToo movement. But that, much like politics, is for a whole other podcast, not mine. In 2016, the Chicks did a surprise performance at the Country Music Association Awards, where they performed the song Daddy's Lessons with Beyoncé, who had actually put the song on her album Lemonade, and it was a song that the Chicks covered during their own concerts. The reaction and backlash was strong, although this time it was mainly about Beyoncé being there more than the Chicks. Some artists, like Alan Jackson, walked out of the performance. Beyoncé used that experience and backlash as fuel to produce her own album of country music called Cowboy Carter. That album went on to win Best Country Album and Album of the Year at the 2025 Grammy Awards. The Guardian newspaper article by Betty Clark that started all the backlash against the Dixie Chicks, now known as the Chicks, published on March 12th, 2003. Before we continue, we'd like to tell you about the Music History Today podcast, where we go over the events that happened on that particular day in music history. The Music History Today podcast drops every single day, including weekends, on this podcast network. Now, back to the Music History In-Depth podcast. All right, let's do some honorable mentions before we continue. Our first honorable mention of this podcast also has to do with leaving a group of sorts. On March 13, 2006, R&B icon Isaac Hayes, who wrote the music for the 1971 movie Shaft, quit his role as chef on the TV show South Park after the show made fun of his religion, Scientology. This after tolerating the show making fun of virtually every other religion in a lot of other episodes, and as the creators reminded everyone, Hayes cashing a lot of rather large checks while they did it. The creators wanted to show how hypocritical Hayes was being. In any event, the show then dealt with the chef character by having him brainwashed by a cult. After the South Park boys tried to rescue him, Chef decided to stay with the cult, but then fell into a ravine and was mauled to death by a bunch of animals. As for Isaac Hayes himself, he passed away from a stroke on August 10, 2008, 10 days before his 66th birthday. On March 17, 1967, one of the greatest rock songs ever recorded was released when the Jimi Hendrix Experience released their song Purple Haze in the United Kingdom. On March 12, 1955, the world lost one of the greatest jazz saxophonists who ever lived. His life was given the biopic treatment in 1988 with the Clint Eastwood-directed movie Bird, starring Forrest Whitaker as the acclaimed jazz icon Charlie Bird Parker, who passed away from pneumonia and a bleeding ulcer on March 12, 1955. On March 16, 1995, rapper Eazy-E of Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees NWA announced that he was HIV positive, becoming one of the first hip-hop stars to publicly announce having the AIDS virus, as the virus was still being stigmatized as being, quote, a gay disease, end quote. Or, as some conservatives said, quote, God's punishment for homosexual behavior, end quote. Eazy-E was diagnosed with the disease on February 26 while in the hospital for a different reason and blamed getting the disease on a female former lover. Eazy-E passed away from AIDS-related complications on March 26, 1995, a month after he found out that he had the disease. On March 17, 2020, New York City bars, restaurants, nightclubs, and concert venues all shut down as COVID-19 lockdowns took effect. Bars and restaurants were restricted to takeout or pickup only. Things started to get shut down almost a week earlier as the NBA canceled their season on March 11th, along with overseas airplane travel starting to be shut down around that time as well. The rest of the country started to shut down over the next week or two until about, give or take, March 22nd, when it seemed like everything seemed to stop and nationwide lockdowns went into effect. Sometimes an organization has a culture that breeds success, either by skill or by luck. Let's go back to the NBA, for instance. A recent example would probably be the San Antonio Spurs, who have their current Hall of Fame coach, Greg Popovich. From Pops, you have his ex-assistant and now three-time championship coach of the Golden State Warriors, Steve Kerr, as well as another of his ex-assistants, former female NBA assistant coach, ex-WNBA All-Star player for the New York Liberty, and current coach of the two-time WNBA champions Las Vegas Aces, Basketball Hall of Famer herself, Miss Becky Hammon, along with Pops' many other successful ex-assistants. It is that culture of excellence that he demands that breeds excellence in its own. But it took him being hired to have those dominoes fall that way. In music, it works a little different. Sometimes it's a city's musical culture that does it. Think back to Seattle in the late 1980s and how many great bands all worked together to make each other better or also to pull each other up. Think Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Mother Love Bone, etc., etc. And then there's the group the Yardbirds, who either bred talent or were just really, really good at spotting it, especially when it came to their guitarist. Sometimes the system works the opposite way, and one person leaves an organization, which leads to a chain of events where other great artists take over, connections are made, which leads to other great bands and careers being born. This next case would be an example of the latter. Let's circle back to the Yardbirds. The Yardbirds started out in the early 1960s and took over the house band gig from the Rolling Stones at the famous Crawdaddy Club in London, England. Top Topham was their original lead guitarist. When he left the band, they got some 18-year-old kid named Eric Clapton or other. Some good. Wonder whatever happened to him. Anyway, Clapton was interested in playing American blues, and in the beginning, the Yardbirds were too, having first made a name for themselves by touring England in support of bluesman Sonny Boy Williamson. Clapton, however, was not happy with the way that the Yardbirds were slowly going, musically-wise at least. The band, influenced a little by the Beatles at the time, started going towards pop and less towards the blues. Clapton was a blues purist. He wanted to be in a blues band. The Yardbirds had recorded a song called For Your Love, a Beatles-influenced pop song. Clapton by then had seen enough. On March 13, 1965, Eric Clapton left the Yardbirds, although it was not officially announced until March 25th. For Your Love, by the way, became a huge hit for the group. And here is where the excellence tree started growing musical branches. First, they had Eric Clapton. When Clapton was leaving, he recommended a guitarist named Jimmy Page. Page was asked to join. Page said, surprisingly, no. The Yardbirds then found a guy by the name of Jeff Beck. Beck was there for a couple of years, and then Page suddenly decided that he wanted to be in the Yardbirds, especially since they were having a lot of success with their pop sound. So for a little while at least, the band had both Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck playing for them. Talk about a double shot. Something eventually had to give, though, so the band ended up firing Beck. The band itself ended up disbanding in 1968. So, what happened to all these people? All right, let's start with the original domino, which was Eric Clapton. He went on to become a member of John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, and then he formed Cream, then Derek and the Dominoes, and then Blind Faith, before finally going on to have an extremely successful solo career. He has been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 3 times, in 1992 as a member of the Yardbirds, in 1993 as a member of Cream, and in 2000 as a solo artist. You can have that argument about why Derek and the Dominoes and Blind Faith are not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I say they should be, but that's beside the point. That is a pretty good success branch right there. But wait, there's more. Jeff Beck went on to form his own group called, in a form of divine creativity, the Jeff Beck Group. You know, sometimes simple is good. He had in his group a lead singer who was in the group The Small Faces and would also have a Hall of Fame solo career. That guy's name, Rod Stewart. He also had a bass player at the time by the name of Ronnie Wood, who would also go on to have a Hall of Fame career. He ended up joining the Rolling Stones. Jimmy Page would go on to form a little indie group of his own, some little-known garage band called Led something or other. Zeppelin, I believe? Yeah, that group. They were actually formed as an offshoot of the last lineup of the Yardbirds that was around in 1968 when they had to finish off contractual concert obligations. All of those guys ended up going into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Beck and Page went in with the Yardbirds in 1992, while Beck got in as a solo artist in 2009, and then Page got in with Led Zeppelin in 1995. As an offshoot, Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood are both in. Rod went in as a solo artist in 1994 and as a member of the Small Faces in 2012, while Ronnie Wood went on, to, of course, to become a member of the Rolling Stones and got in 1989, and also got in as a member of the Faces in 2012. Some say that all those groups, as important as they were, would have gotten together eventually. I beg to differ. If Clapton had stayed with the Yardbirds during their run, then at the very least he wouldn't have joined John Mayall, invented Cream, Derek and the Dominoes, and Blind Faith. He might have gotten around to it, but that would have been much later. That right there is 4 classic rock groups that would have been, if they had formed later on, let's say average at best. Plus, if he had recorded Layla with the Yardbirds, I highly doubt it would have been as good or as meaningful, trustfully. Beck and Page may have gone on to do other things, but they probably wouldn't have been as good. For instance, had Page not have been in the Yardbirds when he may not have met Robert Plant or John Bonham or John Paul Jones, and Led Zeppelin might have been meh, instead of being one of the most important groups ever assembled in rock music history. Now, it actually took Clapton leaving at that particular moment in music history to put the pieces into action. Sometimes the world just works in mysterious ways, and it does it with a reason in mind. In San Antonio's case, Greg Popovich had to be hired in order to get all of those dominoes to go. In Clapton's case, he had to leave. Eric Clapton leaving the Yardbirds and unknowingly changing the music landscape for at least a couple generations on March 13th, 1965. Here's one for all you true crime detectives out there. Ephraim Lewis was a British up-and-coming neo-soul singer in the early 1990s. He released one album, 1992's Skin, which had the hit song Drowning in Your Eyes. In 1994, Ephraim was living in Los Angeles. On March 18, 1994, Los Angeles police were called to Ephraim's apartment because of a report about, quote, a naked black man acting crazy, end quote. When police found Lewis, he fled by climbing up the balconies of his building up to the 4th floor. Police confronted Lewis on that 4th floor balcony where they tased him 3 times. According to the police report, the tasers had little to no effect on him. According to police, Lewis then fell from the balcony to the ground where he sustained severe head injuries. He was taken to the hospital where he died later that night at the age of 26. The coroner listed his death as a suicide. However, there's a bunch of unanswered questions as to what happened that Lewis's relatives have actually tried to get answered. And at last check, the LAPD has declined to investigate their department's actions. For instance, was Ephraim on drugs, medication, or was he having a complete mental episode? What happened on that balcony that required the guy to be tased 3 times? I'm not saying that the police forced him over the edge, but after getting tased 3 times, was his fall actually a suicide, as the coroner said, or was he disoriented from being tased and accidentally fell over the balcony? An inquiry should be done into this, even though we're now on the 31st anniversary of that unfortunate tragedy. But really, somebody should reopen the investigation just to put it to bed once and for all. The family deserves answers. The death of singer Ephraim Lewis in Los Angeles, California on March 18th, 1994. Someone once asked me if I could build a Mount Rushmore of musical acts, who would be on it? I've said that you can't do one for music overall because there's way too many people who have helped to shape it. You would have to build one for each time period and type of music. For instance, for classical music, I would have to put Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart automatically on there, with the 4th spot being up for debate. For the early part of rock and roll, i.e. from the mid-1950s, we'll say right up until 1960, I would have to put Elvis Presley, Fats Domino, and Little Richard on there. However, I would also have to have this man front and center on it in terms of crafting rock and roll and giving it its attitude. Chuck Berry was born on October 18, 1926 in St. Louis, Missouri. From the beginning, Chuck was interested in music. He performed during high school, but once he got out of high school, he settled into a normal life, got married, and worked in an assembly plant assembling cars. He still had the music bug, though, so he started performing with the Johnny Johnson Trio, and it was there that he honed his showmanship skills, having studied what T-Bone Walker was doing on stage, the legendary T-Bone Walker, that is. One day in May of 1955, Berry went to Chicago, Illinois. He happened to meet the great Muddy Waters, who told him to have a talk with Leonard Chess of Chess Records, as Muddy had been recording with Chess Records at the time. Chess took a look at Berry. They saw that rhythm and blues was beginning to go down in popularity, and they were looking to stretch their sound into new genres. And they thought that Berry might just be the person to help them do that. Berry took a country music song called Ida Red, reworked it, and recorded it. He changed the name to Maybelline. It became a huge hit. He had a bunch of hits in the first decade of his career, from Johnny Be Good to No Particular Place to Go to Roll Over Beethoven to rock and roll music. Berry geared his music towards teenager. That was his secret sauce. He talked about good times, cars, girls, and fun. His stage act became legendary, especially when he bent down and hopped across the stage on one leg, which became known as the duck walk. He made a good living with his touring, and in short, he became the template for other artists to copy. As with most acts, though, with the good comes the bad sometimes. Berry was busted as a child for armed robbery. In 1962, he served 1.5 years of a 3-year sentence for transporting a minor across state lines. Some people believe that it was a trumped-up charge, no pun intended, based on racism, as the minor in charge, quote-unquote, was white. He also, later in life, got caught for tax evasion and also was sued for filming women changing their clothes in the bathroom. That latter charge he denied, but the suit was settled. Chuck continued to play almost 100 shows a year worldwide, and then cut back to playing at least once a month in a local restaurant near St. Louis, where he lived. Chuck Berry lived to be 90 years old, passing away on March 18th, 2017. Today, he is considered to be one of the greatest pioneers of rock and roll. When the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted its first class in 1986, Chuck Berry's name was front and center on the first ballot. On Rolling Stone magazine's Greatest Artists of All Time list, he is ranked at number 5. 6 of his songs made Rolling Stones' 500 Greatest Songs of All Time list, with Johnny Be Good being the highest at number 7. Johnny Be Good is also the only rock and roll song that was put on the gold record on the Voyager spacecraft that is now at the edge of the solar system. Father of rock and roll, indeed. Chuck Berry passed away at the age of 90 on March 18th, 2017. All right, we can't leave this podcast on such a downer between Ephraim Lewis and Chuck Berry, so how about we talk about the debut of a pioneering hip-hop group? The original nicknames for this group were DJ Run, Don of Curtis Blow, Easy D, and Jazzy Jace. Back in the early 1980s, there were 3 kids who grew up in Hollis, Queens. Joseph Simmons had an older brother named Russell, who was a hip-hop promoter and had started a record label with his college roommate, Rick Rubin, called Def Jam Records. Russell, at the time, promoted rapper Curtis Blow and needed someone to be Curtis's DJ. Joseph was recruited to be that DJ, and soon Joseph wanted to rap for himself. Russell let Joseph record one song, which went absolutely nowhere. In the meantime, Joseph had a friend named Daryl McDaniel. The two of them wanted to rap as a duo. At first, Russell said no because he didn't like Daryl's rap style, but he eventually gave in. They needed a DJ, though, so they got their friend Jason Mizell. Russell then changed their nicknames. So Joseph DJ Run, son of Curtis Blow, became Run. Daryl Easy D became DMC. And Jason Jazzy Jace became Jam Master J. And the group became known as Run DMC. For the record, they all hated the name of the group, but it kind of stuck with them, so they went with it. They signed to Profile Records and released their first single, It's Like That, on March 12, 1983, with the B-side Sucker MCs. The song was written by the group and was produced by rap legend Curtis Blow, along with Eli Tubo. The song hit number 15 on the Billboard R&B charts. In 1997, house DJ Jason Nevins released a dance remix of the song, and the remix went top 10 in 19 different countries, including hitting number 1 in 13 countries, mainly in Europe. The remix only got as high as number 13 on the American singles chart. After the success of their debut single, they released their first album, Run DMC, in 1984. That album had hits like Hard Times, along with the transcending song Rock Box, with a mixture of hip-hop and hard rock, complete with the blistering guitar of session musician Eddie Paul Martinez. The song was one of the first to combine what were, at least at that point, two separate worlds, black inner-city hip-hop and white heavy metal. Both were considered dangerous in the eyes of the mainstream, which made them a perfect combination for the kids to follow, especially kids like me. 1985 was a huge year for the group, from a career perspective at least. First, they released their next album, King of Rock, which further solidified their sound with the songs King of Rock and Can You Rock It Like This. They were then the only hip-hop act to perform at Live Aid. They were on the Philadelphia end, not the London end. They followed that up with an appearance in the hit movie Crush Groove. 1986 saw their biggest success with one of the most important albums of the 1980s, Raising Hell. The album was produced by Rick Rubin, who had a major role in one of the most important songs of all time. The album was almost done when they decided to do one more song to pique the interest from their fans who had liked the hard rock sounds of King of Rock and Rockbox. After some discussion, they fell upon the idea of doing Walk This Way by Aerosmith. Originally, they were going to sample the song, but Rick and Jam Master Jay wanted to redo the song completely. They put out the call to Aerosmith to gauge interest in the entire project. At first, there really wasn't any. What has to be remembered is that in 1985, no one liked Aerosmith. I mean, no one. Known as the Toxic Twins at that point, Aerosmith's Steven Tyler and Joe Perry were looked at as part of a group whose heyday was in the 1970s, and they also had a lot of drugs, alcohol, and other internal band issues. But mainly, it was a lot of drugs and alcohol. They were, at that point, done as a band. Over. Finito. Even with their careers in freefall, though, Steven and Joe didn't want to do the song because, to be honest, they hated hip-hop. To them and a lot of other artists at that point, hip-hop was taking their songs, using them without paying the artists, and making money off of them. The Toxic Twins wanted no part of it. Rick convinced them to come down to the studio to work things out. And once they saw how Jam Master Jay could cut the record precisely where he wanted the beat to be at will on the turntables, they were fascinated, and then they wanted in on the collaboration. The music video also became iconic. The video unfolds with both acts on opposite sides of a wall. And then once Run DMC starts rapping loud to the beat, Steven breaks through the wall with a mic stand, and then everybody ends up on a concert stage together as a show of solidarity and breaking down the barriers between both the rock and hip-hop cultures until an administration calls it DEI, and, well, let's not go there. Anyway, rumor has it that Steven could not break down the wall at first, but they left that part in the final cut. The song, album, and music video all became huge hits, along with becoming icons of 1980s music. It also gave Aerosmith their career back, as the band got back together and started putting out hit songs like Love in an Elevator, Dude Looks Like a Lady, Angel, Jaded, among many, many, many other songs. In fact, they're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, along with Run DMC. After the success of Raising Hell, Run DMC put out Tougher Than Leather and Down with the King, but by then the sound that the group had pioneered had already changed, and actually so did they. The three guys started to not get along, and they started to go off in different directions musically. Run became a minister, while Jay became a producer, producing the group Onyx, who had the hit song Slam. You may remember that one from back in the day. Jay also apparently became a drug dealer, at least according to court records. In 2002, Jay was shot and killed in his recording studio in Queens, New York, in what prosecutors said was a revenge killing after Jay had pulled out of a drug deal. His murder was finally solved almost 20 years later, as two men were convicted of his murder on February 27, 2024. In fact, one of those men was one of his godchildren. Ouch. Run DMC was one of the most influential hip-hop groups of all time. They later influenced rap rock acts like Korn, Kid Rock, Limp Bizkit, The Prodigy, and others. They were the first hip-hop act on American Bandstand, the first hip-hop act to earn a gold record with Run DMC, first one to get a platinum album with King of Rock, and a multi-platinum album with Raising Hell. They were also the first hip-hop group to get played on MTV, and they were the first hip-hop act to be nominated for a Grammy Award. The debut single by one of rap music's pioneering icons, Run DMC's It's Like That, and That's the Way It Is, released on March 12th, 1983. And that is it for the Music History In-Depth podcast for March 12th through the 18th. Thank you very, very much for listening and or watching if you're watching on Spotify or YouTube.